I'm not too sure how well this will work. If we're going to have a discussion of prejudice and bigotry and racism inside role playing, inside the fiction that we're making, and what that means and can do, if we're going to do that, then we have to set some boundaries and baselines. That's what this is for. Going forward, here's what we take as bedrock in the labs and discussions here. Okay, 5 things maybe. First thing, I'll keep it quick, is that we're discussing the fiction that we create. I'm not that interested in the text as an expression of real life attitudes. In other words, I'm not going to talk about what the authors meant. I'm not going to talk about what the authors assumed wrongly or things like that. It's kind of easy to slide into that, and if we do once in a while, that's fine, but it's not really the topic. It's not about rating and reviewing the texts in terms of how racist they may be and so on. That is a good discussion. It's an important issue. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done or that it can't be done. I'm saying that's not really where I'm at with this. I'm much more interested in those things as they are part of the fiction we are producing, just as you may have a novel or book or movie about issues of racism and so forth. You could have role-playing that's like that too. And that's very different from the text itself being racist or whatnot. So we're just going to stick with what it is we're doing with it, what it provides that makes that possible, and whether and when that's good. I think that's a good discussion. That's the first one. The second one, let's talk about the activity of racism. The activity of racism is transitive. Somebody is doing it, directing it outward. And it is part and parcel of any number of dreadful things. Discrimination, intolerance, all the way up to atrocity, ethnic cleansing, all sorts of slavery, all sorts of things. We're talking about a behavior, but I really want to focus on it as a group behavior, something that people do and then they feel validated in their group by doing. So I'm not really talking about what's in someone's heart of hearts or their particular personal attitudes. I'm much more interested in a group collective effort. And when directed toward other individuals, it's usually phrased in terms of attacking the group to which those individuals belong. What's another important point about these things? They don't hang their hats on anything real. There's an incredible disjunct between what's claimed about that group and what is actually the case. And I want to focus on the former, the fantasy of racism, which is that group is unutterably different. There is something about them that just renders them straight off of consideration as fellow human beings. Whatever it may be, that's it. You see, look at that. Oh, difference, done. We're here, they're here, we're better than them. It's common sense evidence, right? That attitude. Now that's the fantasy. And I want to focus on a very important point about it, which is that it can hang its hat on anything. And no matter how minor or made up, or even how much the variable in question overlaps between the targeter and targeted, no matter what, it will always have the same conclusion. The racism doesn't care how much. The racism thinks it cares, but it really just wants to point and shoot and finger point and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't want to care really about how much difference there is. It could be a very great deal. It could be a very, very little. It could be infinitesimal and mostly, if perhaps even entirely, made up. And the racist is just as happy either way, anyway. So I really want to focus on this. This is not a predictable phenomenon based on the degrees of difference in appearance and practice among human beings. Racism is a behavior. It doesn't even matter if the word race, of course, I'll stomp on in a minute or so, but let's say that is another race. Racism still doesn't care. All it wants to do is be itself and be bad, do the bad things. And if it's a lot of difference, then the effect and the behavior are exactly the same as if it's just like the same people who've been living next to you this whole time and they just happen to wear a different hat. And you're going to go off the beam and go crazy and call them, subordinate or inferior and, not really human and all the rest of it, taking your job, all that stuff. And because it's so obviously patently different from you. So keep that in mind, especially for role-playing when we're talking about all these, well, they call them fantasy races, science fiction races. It's this in-hobby term. You could have, your four-armed elves and your one-eyed dwarves and all the rest of it and say, oh, they're so different. I mean, they must be so terribly prejudiced against each other. I mean, if humans get all upset about this difference, then they've got to get incredibly upset about that difference. No, racism doesn't care. It will be its dreadful self to the full extent that the people are employing it with minimal to absent differences. So the extent of the observable difference is not an important variable. All right, so that was part 2, kind of long. Let's talk about part 3. And this has to do with, differences, and then you use race like it was a thing. And a second ago, are there races? What? The myth of race comes from the idea that we have centers of uniform types, that there are centers of origin even of these types. And therefore, no matter what hand waving you have to do, people do all this hand waving and say, yeah, whatever happened. But we ended up with these centers of origin of different types. And the idea being that they expand outward from those centers of origin and everything's fine until, glory be, some fool stuck us all on the same planet together. Now we bumped up against each other, and what can you do? Of course we're not going to get along. We're different. That's the myth of race. It is not confirmed by any data we have in any way, shape, or form. I usually don't pull this particular rope, but you are talking to an actual evolutionary biologist, and if I do say so myself, not that bad one. So, let me tell you. What you call human physical diversity, it ain't shit. That isn't a diversity. Not from anybody who's familiar with the kind of organismal diversity that we look across on this planet, even within any number of other species. So, get over it. It ain't nothing. Here's the more important point, which is that all the genetic detail, which really isn't very much, little itsy bitsy teeny tiny bit of genetic information, not much at all, that has anything to do with the way different humans appear, any of that is part of this vast stew that is observable across the densest masses of humans historically. Let's see, geographically that would put us, let's kind of center it on the Eastern Mediterranean and kind of run it east and west in kind of a band. That would be pretty much the population, massive population density of humans before about 500 years ago. And so you have this band, and then you will have basically a whole bunch of drifting and migration and traveling and departure and whatnot from that band from as long as there have been humans, but it's trackable and it's understandable. And using itsy bitsy teeny tiny generally inconsequential genetic information, we learned a lot about the history of this. Language development also tracks it, as one might expect. And so what you end up with is a really good picture of the dispersal of humans across the planet. And here's the point. When you end up with some characteristic differences from spot to spot in terms of some very minor variables, when you take a look at that, you find that it is really just a different percentage of the same existing variables in the great big kind of dense stew pot thereof. So we're not talking about something new off there in that area. Even if the humans are visibly pretty distinctive there, it's not new. It's just a different set of percentages of the same mix and match all these little teeny tiny details that were already there. And the fact that this has happened in history on a geography means that it's not a uniform spread from one perfect little center out in a perfect circle and with perfect distribution of every single variable in the same percents. No, it's happened in a much more piecemeal, much more contingent and who got there, kind of fashion and what happened along the way. But therefore, what I'm saying is that humans aren't different. What you have is just some, bit of a cosmic joke there that the contingent and uninteresting variables in question get rearranged slightly through the vagaries of who, what, when, and where, and how far, and you end up with variables that apparently to us visibly, get us all excited. So there's some biology for you, which basically, takes the word race and says, that ain't what happened, and goes from there. What's also important is to recognize that since we are talking about results, not starting points, that those results are only results because they happen to be right now. In other words, they're only results in terms of time. They're not results in terms of any other process. And therefore, any two humans who get together and get with it, it's just mixing it up again. And that's happened again and again and again in all kinds of places where people end up coming together rather than wandering off. So, there you go. Before you start talking about, types and variations of humans, just keep in mind that you're talking about little twiggy kind of situations over there and off there and stuff like that. Learn a little bit of biogeography, learn a little bit of the history, and you will find that most of what you've ever picked up about races ain't. All right, before you want to go and get into the bio stuff of it all, let's get back to role-playing. First and foremost, race, elf, dwarf, hobbit. Using that word for those is arguably one of the great... I hesitate to think of what any academic analyst will make of this over the course of the decades, because it is just absurd. We are talking about species, right? Well, no, not really, because most people don't even know what a species is. And no, if you start telling me, well, they're reproductively isolated, shut up. You're talking to an evolutionary biologist, and all that is a bunch of bourgeois too. So we're not talking about species. We're not talking about human ethnicities even. We're talking about interesting literary and mythological conventions. And those literary and mythological conventions are things that interest us. And whether they are most resonant to a particular group of gamers because elf and dwarf and troll and whatnot all seem to kind of match up to their high school cliques, maybe that's the case. Or maybe we're simply drawing upon a set of historical but very, very, very local issues among humans. Well, let's see. We could talk about from roughly, northern Germany through northern France and Belgium and whatnot, and up through a little bit of Scandinavia, but primarily over to the British Isles, where every single little patch of land has a different name and somebody standing on it and yelping about their nationalistic this and that. I don't know why the Balkans gets all the criticism for this when you just look over at the British Isles and you're like, whoa, crazy people. So anyway, we have an enormous amount of literature coming out of all of those little regions that we came out of, I just mentioned, and we care too much about it. And you can look at most of the fantasy races, and they're standing in for one or another of that particular set of concerns as dramatized in literature and myth, not in any other way. So, insofar as that's important to us, which to many of us culturally it is, being a big part of our education, a big part of our symbology, and all wrapped up with this other thing called Rome. And if you think we don't care about that, then just turn a quarter over, Americans, and look at the bird and tell me what you think about, Rome not mattering. And so we basically have a lot of this cultural legacy going on, and a lot of us, pick it up, fetishize it, turn it into role-playing symbology via Tolkien, via, Robert Jordan or whatever, and you end up with this material. It's a pretty rich little weird subcultural mix when you look at the plethora of role-playing games, particularly the ones that are designated fantasy role-playing games, once that word became specifically associated with 1980 Dungeons and Dragons. So you end up with this really, really interesting kind of concentrated, parsed. It's kind of the opposite of bug juice. Instead of making little government-sponsored bug juice syrup and putting water in it and putting sugar, it's kind of the other way around. You take this drink and you kind of distill out a whole bunch of stuff, take away all the water and you take away all the sugar and whatever, and there it is, all weird and funny tasting and syrupy, and that is D&D fantasy. This weird stuff you're supposed to do something with now. Now you go and you add your own water and your sugar and stuff like that. So we've seen this done 1,000 times, and each one of them is just stuffed full of the races. You got your science fiction version as well, where whether you've got, 6 legs and tusks, or whether you've got reptilian scales, or whether you're a bunch of blinky iridescent lights wondering what love is and all that stuff, you've got a century of aliens as available conventions for us to put these terms, labels, parsing of variables that all wrapped up in our literature and myth and our cultural hassles, and making them interesting in some kind of way for that particular story. So role-playing in that sense is actually extremely similar to just all of literature / pop culture. The word race and species usually being used in some uncritical way just to provide that opportunity. So therefore, when we talk about that in role-playing, bear in mind that we're talking about little hooks to hang conventions on in different arrangements for our discourse of play. Okay, is that bad? Is that good? Well, I think it's a lot like a given book or a given movie. It can be very, very good. It can be very, very bad. When this was first brought up at Adepts Play by a contributor, their biggest concern was realism. And there were a couple of weird things in that discussion. There was a little bit of reliance on the idea of these centers of ethnicity coming up against one another and therefore encountering each other in border regions and stuff like that. And that's really not the way it's happened. There is also concerns that the more different the group, the more intolerance one might expect, which again isn't really what happens. So when we talk about realism, the problem about that term is that, of course, what's real to you isn't real to me. So we're not really talking about realism at all. We're just talking about competing notions of what is tolerable to us as creative contributors. Period. That's all that people mean by the word realism, ever. So when I say this, I'm saying, all right, well, let's breathe a little deep and say, what do we mean by wanting to invoke, to reference, and utilize the history of prejudice, intolerance, racism, bigotry, and the violent expressions thereof in our role-playing fiction? One may well say that stuff is wretched and awful, and I don't want certain acts in my role-playing, and I don't want that stuff in there either. Much as if you don't want to go and see a show with that in it. Well, okay, bearing in mind that one could see a show with that stuff in it, which very clearly is critical thereof, and very clearly is worth doing and worth experiencing. Perhaps it's critical of it in a fashion that you had not previously conceived. So all sorts of interesting things that are maybe it prompts reflection. That's one of the most important things we can do with racism and bigotry is to prompt reflection so that somebody who prides themselves on their absence thereof gets a bit of a jolt and recognizes that, ain't no clean hands around here sometimes. So with that going on, one can simply say that in role-playing as an activity, this is very much like any other troublesome content. Either it's in there and it's serving some strong and useful and provocative and perhaps enlightening role, or it's in there and it's in there in sort of a sense of, well, this is how people are and it's bugging me and we're depicting it because without it, we're not really all that convinced that we're talking about real characters. And that's, well, there are worse things to do than that, for sure. Certainly there's the danger of having the behavior in there as a way to indulge in it, which I think is the big fear, leads to a huge defensive crouch. It can't be in there at all, lest somebody do that. And that's kind of, I'm going to lay it to you as a matter of responsibility. We are doing creative work here, and should you care to criticize that in someone else's creative work, you go right ahead, and I think you'd be perfectly justified in doing so or addressing that. On the other hand, we're talking about what you're doing, not what they're doing. And that's something I'd like to focus on in our talks. What is it we do with material of this kind? And what does that mean? There's my baseline. Those are my thoughts. We're taking it from here.